a dean or two involved in this as we went along, so that we had the institutional blessing, and he was very much involved in that. Sherry Stewart joined the GCEP team when Frank Sproul retired. She was the mainstay of helping us build the working relationships amongst all of the partners, the companies and Stanford, and so she was a very important player. Philippe Lecourt-Gaillet, then with Schlumberger, was a critical player as well. I'm remembering a conversation in which he was in Paris and the rest of us were at Schlumberger's lab in Connecticut. Aside from a few technical difficulties in getting the link to be made, he was a key player from the very beginning. Nate, you just heard from Nate Lewis from Caltech on the video, and he was an early GCEP PI and then a theme leader in the area that he's working in now. So he was important. And maybe the most important of all of us is Shannon Miller at the end. Shannon was a graduate student working in Chris Edwards' lab, and so she'll be able to tell you the truth about how this really did work. So Philippe, let me start with you. So think back to, I mean, you heard me and Brian holding forth on what we think we remember of how the process started. Tell us about your memories of the early days.
Well, the early days were, the first thing was for the company to try to understand how serious the climate thing was, all right? And you remember we started, let's say, in the consciousness of companies around '92, where the Rio Summit started. People started talking a lot about this. There were a lot of discussion, but it was not yet considered to be, certainly inside of Schlumberger, a very hot topic, if you want, if I may say that, for climate change. And when I became the chief scientist of Schlumberger in '97. I remember one of the first things we've done is to go visit Lamont Doherty, which was a lab which is very close to our lab in Connecticut. And there we met Wally Brocker. So I don't know if, I'm sure many of you know Wally Brocker. And he really sort of convinced all of us, we were like five or six from the lab coming, that this was really a serious issue and that we needed to think about it very hard. And then about 2 weeks or about a month later, in October '98, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of our lab in Connecticut. And we invited, as a part of the anniversary, a debate between Jim Hansen and Richard Lindzen from MIT, as you know. So a very hot debate, of course. But we must say that everybody listened to the objection that Richard Lindzen was making, but Jim Hansen sort of convinced all of us that indeed this was something very serious. So from there on, if you want, we had sort of a conversation that what are we going to do about this? We cannot ignore that this is something very important. We need to work on that. And we started looking for partners, and actually I remember talking to you, as you know, because one of the angles we said we could do was CCS. I mean, carbon storage was something in which Schlumberger could contribute because of the monitoring and understanding, fluid in porous media. So we worked on that, but quickly it went beyond that. But the key thing was to convince people that this was something that really we needed to do something about, if you want.
Yeah. So, Jim, you were involved in the early conversations. I remember a trip that you and I made to the Dallas-Fort Worth area to talk to ExxonMobil senior folks about it. So, look back from your perspective. Where did we stand on thinking about energy at Stanford in those days, and how has that evolved since?
It's actually a really interesting question, and I knew you were going to ask me this, and so I've actually thought a little bit about it. Going back and remembering how the world was a decade ago or 15 years ago, it's easy for us to reinvent things and make up things and think about how we think it was. But actually, I think I have a pretty clear view of how, especially the School of Engineering was in the 1990s, for example, with respect to energy. And as I think about that time period and look around at what our faculty and our students were doing, I mean, energy was basically nowhere in the School of Engineering here. I think of a few isolated people. The person that comes to mind, since I'm a double E, is Dick Swanson, who I had an office right beside him for many years. And he had a small group working on high-efficiency silicon photovoltaics, and frankly, I think he struggled, to support just a few graduate students at that point in time. And eventually, as you know, he left Stanford to form SunPower to try and commercialize some of his ideas. I think in mechanical engineering, there were a few brave souls who were working on coal and combustion and a few other things, but and in civil engineering, a little bit of work going on. But the truth is, energy was not a major part of the portfolio in the engineering school. It wasn't even on our strategic radar in terms of being a mission we ought to be taking on at a grand scale to try and change things globally. So why? Why was that? Well, I mean, if you think about university research, I mean, there are two things which are critical to build an effective research program. The first is faculty interest in taking on really important problems. And the second is the wherewithal to do that. And in universities, the wherewithal to do that is basically external research funding from the federal government, from state governments, or from corporations, or occasionally from gifts that come in. And I think if you look back at the 1980s and 1990s in the School of Engineering here, the reason there was virtually nothing going on in energy was not because of a lack of interest, but rather because there was simply no funding available to support research for our faculty and our students. So it was a very, very different landscape in that time period.
So Sherry, you have the advantage of the perspective of dealing with lots of universities and of course dealing with the various companies. Can you reflect a bit on the business of creating this relationship, this set of industry academic partnerships to tackle big problems? I think you're in as good a position as anybody in the world to be able to do that. So tell us how you're feeling about all that now that you've had a chance to step back.
Well, I think it was clear at the outset of this program, and Jim said it very well, that if you looked at the level of funding for energy research, it was in a trough at about the year 2000. Professor Johansson's chart showed that very clearly. So there was a need to jumpstart the solutions, and if you looked at the size of the program we were considering then, it was large for the sponsor companies involved, but by the scale of the kind of money that comes from governments for research, it wasn't large. So one of our key challenges in forming this between the sponsor companies and Stanford was to figure out how to make this program effectively a catalyst. It had to have leverage. It had to find a way to essentially expand beyond the direct dollars that the sponsor companies were going to put into it. And I think that took us to this idea of designing the program to focus on technologies that I'll call are at the very front end of the research pipeline, fundamental breakthrough technologies, with the idea that once those were funded, other forms of funding would be attracted and would build on that, so you would get a natural leverage. And I think Nate's program he mentioned this in the video, is a classic example of that, where the seed came from the GCEP research, but the big money to grow it is really going to come from other sources. And so I think our challenge, to get kind of back to your question, was to find people who were like-minded in, if you will, having the belief, the faith, that starting to work on these seed technologies, which might have much longer term fruition, that was a worthwhile effort. And I think 10 years out, the thing that GCEP can demonstrate is that that was the right strategy. That was the, if you will, the window that the funding from the sponsors could go through to make a difference. And the leverage that's coming from that focus, I think, will continue to be the thing that makes GCEP special.
Yes, as I think back on this, as we were designing the process of thinking about areas in which to work and how to produce a good portfolio of projects, we really settled on sort of three simple ideas. One was that whatever we funded needed to be good science or engineering science, that we try to avoid violating the second law any more than we have to, that there be a pathway to have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions at some sort of scale, that there's lots of cool energy stuff that might function only at small scale, but we did want to think about the big picture. And then the last was the step-out criterion. In other words, it's so important in universities for research groups to be able to take a sustained look at some area, but it's also good every now and again to go do something that's a little different. So we said, we're really going to try to focus on the opportunity for breakthrough potential. And so what that did in the university, I think, was we never said to anybody, we are looking for interdisciplinary proposals. But one of the ways research groups figured out a way to meet that step-out criterion was to band together to work on a problem that neither group could pull off on their own. And so it actually created a lot of interdisciplinary activity on campus, but without ever setting that as a specific goal. So,
may I add just one thing?
Sure.
To me, GCEP has changed not only the landscape of energy research in Stanford, it changed it in academia, everywhere. When in 1997, when I started my job, I remember looking at energy research in universities around the world. And around the world, I mean, Russia, France, the UK, Germany, and the US, of course. And it was dismal. It was not only, a few isolated people actually struggled to do something. And a few years later, when GCEP was created, I was inundated by people who wanted us to finance large energy research program that we had started. I remember, for example, John Deutsch was on the board of directors of Schlumberger, and he was, of course, a big MIT guy. And he gave me a hard time sending money to Stanford instead of MIT, which, of course, was the next thing just went to him. So to me, it completely changed the game in putting energy as a key topic for academia, and that to me is a major contribution of GCEP.
Yes, I had 1,000 emails within the first 24 hours, but my favorite was the guy who said, $225 million? Nothing. He says, you give us that money, we'll invest it, return it 10 times over, and then you'll have enough to actually do something. So Nate, you've been involved in GCEP as an insider in a variety of ways, as a PI, as a theme leader, and as a player in your own institution in thinking about how you tackle all these kinds of problems. So tell us about your perspective on all of this. I know you already said nice things in the video. We'll pay you later for that. But take a crack at what you think the working relationship was with GCEP.
Right. Well, there were several things. One, I, like probably many of the people in this room, was old enough gray hairs to have gotten into science and energy in the 70s and the energy crisis we had then. It's what got me into science. That was our kind of Apollo program of the 70s, was energy. And then, like many people, when oil went down to $8 a barrel in the 80s and there wasn't much of a problem, support pretty much dried up, and found other things to do. Right? Then I personally came to my senses in about the 2000 period, realized that there was a big problem. And it wasn't just a political problem of legislative and IPCC, it was rooted in science and technology, and that we were going to have to do something. But there were almost no outlets to go to. The federal government hadn't come to this same conclusion, and the funding was small, scattered, short-term. There was really nowhere to go, except GCEP became that outlet where people with good step-out ideas focused on, you took the three exact things, step-out ideas, rooted in good science, focused on low-carbon, scalable technologies. It's that convergence that I think is the brilliance of structuring GCEP around those three simultaneous circles in the Venn diagram, right? Because that was really the missing gap. And so it let people like me and the other people who now have been built in a sense of community actually get together and talk about what we could do and what good ideas could be done to help move from where we were with, I'd say, a neutral slope into a get your foot on the energy gas, very positive, exciting area. I think we made this into a modern discipline where departments are built at academic institutions around energy institutes and energy initiatives that didn't exist, weren't in people's horizons 10 years ago. So I think GCEP has had a tremendous leading role outlet in that. And honestly, from my personal perspective, you know, there are several levels of this, and I know he's going to be modest, but you know, there's UC San Diego, and it's forever linked to Roger Revelle, who had the vision and the founder. And you see this over and over again with institutes that really do something new. And so one of the things that I think that will distinguish GCEP is Lenore, right? And you know, he knew how to get that convergence and get the right mix of, in the model of not too much dictatorial and enough freedom, and yet building the community that partitioned not just into science, not just into engineering, but into policy, into the corporate relations. All of these enterprises are really formed by a few people, and I think, you know, we all really owe a lot to Lynn for carrying through that.
Well, I hasten to point out that I was not working alone. And in particular, Chris Edwards played a huge role in thinking through all of this and many conversations with many of the people in this room. One of the things I like to think about in all of this is the fact that you know, when you work on something that matters over an extended period with a bunch of really talented people, good things flow from that, but the other thing that happens is you get to be friends. And so there are a lot of friends in all of this that I think that's been an important part of the process too. Now, using Chris Edwards' name was a good segue to my next question, and that's to ask Shannon. So Shannon endured pretty much endless teasing from me because she was working on this combustion engine setting with very high pressures. And to me, this thing kind of looked like a rocket ship to begin with. So I kept teasing her that I wanted her to let me know when she was going to run the thing so I could be at least off campus and maybe out of the state. And she retaliated by asking me to chair her dissertation defense, which of course she did a great job of. So Shannon, you had the perspective of being a graduate student. I mean, talk about being in the trenches. That's where the real work gets done. And you were working on a GCEP-supported project. Was that different from other kinds of projects, or how did that work from your standpoint. And then, of course, because you've gone to a startup company trying to commercialize that technology, I know people would be interested, maybe the other students would be interested in your perspective on what that's like and how's all that going, and without revealing any of the technology secrets that you need. But if you could just take a minute and talk about the experience of being a GCEP student.
Sure. Well, I guess the first thing that I learned, calling vendors, was they also had the same response of, well, honey, why don't you tell me when you fire that thing up so that I can be out of town? And I quickly realized that grad students were responsible for their own safety. So we quickly built a giant frame around said engine with ballistic steel and all sorts of other things to make sure that when we did break something, which Chris Edwards was fully supportive of, we wouldn't hurt anyone. But so my perspective as a GCEP student was, I think I had my head down while you guys were thinking a much bigger picture, and I think I was in the right place at the right time. But I came into Chris Edwards' lab because I thought he was approaching problems from a very fundamental perspective. And when I came to his lab, he said, I want you to think about how to make chemical engines more efficient. You have a box, you have fuel coming in, and you have work coming out. How do you make that more efficient? And needless to say, it took me 6 months to even really figure out what the problem was and how to define that in a way that made sense. But then, we spent a while thinking about the theory. And after a few years, we had a number of ways that we thought we could improve engine efficiency. But there was one that really seemed like the most exciting and had the most opportunity to really significantly increase engine efficiency. And at that point, personally, I had decided, Chris, I really want to work on some hardware. This theory is exciting, but I really want to build something. And so at that point, we decided, hey, let's write this proposal to GCEP and build the test device that we think we need to build to test this concept. And so from my perspective, it was really exciting because we were building the device that we thought we needed to build to test the concept, not building something we needed to build to get funded. So, I think a lot of people don't necessarily have that same experience. They come in, here's your test device. It's already been built by someone else. You can modify it a little bit to get your PhD. This is, and I really had a different experience. So, and I think that's largely because of GCEP and the funding that was there for it. So we built that device exactly how we wanted to build it, which was exciting. And consequently, we were able to prove the theory, prove the hypothesis was correct. And it was just the first stepping stone of what needed to go into building high efficiency engines. But the whole time that you're doing that, you're thinking, well, what if this is right? What do we do next? What are the next steps to actually have this technology make an impact on the world? You don't really know what that looks like when you start, but you start to think about that as you go. And in the end, as Lynn mentioned, I started a company with two of my co-founders who are also from Chris Edwards' lab. One of them actually was there from the beginning building the device at Stanford with me, Matt. And so we started a company. It's been running for about 2 years now. And a lot of things change when you apply different constraints, going back to sort of thermodynamics. And the solutions sometimes look different than when you started in an academic research setting. But the fundamentals are still there and are still driving the core technology.
So actually, Nate and Jim, maybe, and Shannon, you as well, I'd be interested in your view of whether the kind of level of student interest and engagement in energy research and energy issues has changed over the 10-year period. Have we made any progress on the goal of getting the student population excited about this?
Oh, dramatically, in my view. Totally changed their attitudes toward important problems that they can go into the careers with. John Brown tells the story of when he gave a talk at Stanford in the business school afterwards. One student came up to him and said, "You're a pretty good person. How are you CEO of a big bad oil company?" And he was so taken aback by the reaction that must have been visceral to, how can you be so corrupt mentality to work for an oil company? We don't have that attitude anymore amongst our colleagues and friends and scientists who value the technology, social, political, and all the dimensions of what energy means to us, and they want to be a part of it. And we see this with the undergraduates, we see this with the graduate students, we see it with people getting careers that want to make a difference. We see our best graduate students wanting to go into clean energy now all over the campus, I think probably here too. So this is a tremendous sea change that can't help but be an overwhelming positive thing in the end.
Maybe I can just add to that from a Stanford perspective. I actually think that the students are often ahead of the rest of us in sort of understanding what the big problems are and the big opportunities are. And I think there was a significant student body in the late 90s and before all of this happened that really saw the issues globally that perhaps we didn't see at that time. And they really wanted to work on these problems. There was no pathway. There were no supported research projects. There were no courses that were being taught, and so they were, I think, extremely frustrated. So GCEP has, in the engineering school here, transformed the engineering school. But let me just give you two quick examples. I think two of our departments in particular are night and day different from what they were 10 or 15 years ago. One of them is mechanical engineering, which is kind of a natural home for a lot of energy-related research. And if you look at you saw several examples on the video, you heard more this morning from Sally. A lot of the projects that are being worked on in GCEP have a home in our mechanical engineering department. It's perhaps been even more dramatic in our material science department because by coincidence, it turned out that we were beginning to transform that department around the time that GCEP began. So more than half of the faculty who are in that department today have been hired in the last 10 years. And there are a set of young people who are just spectacular. And since we do broad area searches for all of our faculty, the people that applied to those searches were people who would not have applied 5 or 10 years earlier because there was no energy presence here, there was no energy program of consequence here. But that's completely changed. And so if you look at the kinds of things that are being done in that department, particularly by the younger faculty who have been recently hired, it's transformed that department. So in research universities, courses usually trickle down from research programs, and you look at the landscape today, and now there's a whole portfolio of courses that are offered broadly around the university that have come out of the GCEP research program. So students have access to courses now, they have access to research opportunities. There have been student clubs that have been formed, the Energy Club, and there are others that we're competing in some national competitions we weren't a player in a decade ago, and so the students have been, I think, transformed as much as the faculty and the research programs and the departments have been transformed. It's been amazing.
I'm told the Energy Club is the biggest student club on campus now, although I haven't personally counted the individuals, but I've heard that's true. So I have a few more questions, and then we'll open it up to some questions from the audience. But Sherry and Philippe, I think both of you are in a good position to kind of think about the energy landscape as a whole. You know, where I mean, Jim made this point, and so did Nate, that things were different 10 years ago. Some things have gone more slowly than we might have hoped, and some things have maybe changed in a variety of ways. So, I mean, any of you can jump in and talk about the energy landscape as a way to think about where we are now and where we might go first.
Because at the outset of GCEP, there was not a lot of research being done at other places, whereas now there are energy centers blossoming everywhere, and as Philippe said, we get lots of requests for funding for them. But that has, in and of itself, has changed the landscape, and I think that creates an opportunity for, maybe a challenge, for GCEP as you go forward, because now that there is this work being done in many different locations, I think there is a need for networking among those locations so that you minimize the risk of reinventing the wheel or people going down alleys that already have been proven not to be fruitful. I think GCEP has a tremendous forward opportunity to act as a hub for information sharing, for idea sharing among all of those research groups that are out there. The nice thing is, with 10 years of history and tremendous credibility on the quality of the research, GCEP is really well positioned to do that. So one thing I think is different in the energy landscape is there are a lot more players, but they need to be tied together effectively.
So in my company, I was involved very often in preparing 10-year plan. You know, you sort of try to understand what's going to happen in the next 10 years. So, you know, you all huddle together and then you make a plan. And I did that, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 times in my career. And after the third time, I was so upset by how unrealistic the plan were that I decided that the only way to do that is to look back 10 years and then compare where we were, where we are today. And see. And when you do this, you find a very interesting observation, which is some things change very quickly, much more than you thought, maybe, and some don't change at all. And so if you look at the energy landscape, it's amazing the number of things which have changed very quickly. I mean, the world, in 10 years, the world GDP has grown 47%. The CO2 emissions have grown 30%, which is a huge number. The CO2 concentration in the air went from, I think, if I have the number here, 372 to 392, so 20 ppm increase in 10 years. And this is about 2 ppm per year, in spite of an increase of 30% of the emissions. So there is something we don't quite understand in where the CO2 is going, that's clear. All right, the ocean that's what you, of course, Mbari type of people. Primary energy consumption went up 30%, but there's a huge diversity. The US and the EU went down in energy consumption, a few percent. While China, of course, and the rest of the world, but China went up like 140% and the rest of the world went down. Now, in terms of the mix, there's something which is quite troubling, really, is that most of the mix didn't change very much, except oil went down 5 points, or 4 points, sorry, in the market share, if you want, of total energy, and coal went up 4 points. So, if you look at the landscape, I would say you're sort of very worried that, it takes a long time to change things, which means that, you guys have a job for probably, job security is good in that business you're going to have. But it takes a huge effort to change this because of the size of the prime, And my last point was, when you measure the energy consumption, people use all sorts of different units. So because of that, it's very confusing. The unit I like to use is terawatt, okay? So the world consumes 16 terawatt of energy, okay? Now, the Earth itself, because of radioactivity inside the Earth, generates a heat flow. The heat flow is 45 terawatt. So the human on the surface of the Earth produces a third of what the Earth itself produces in terms of heat, which is a huge number, right? I mean, Professor Johansson, I think, showed one of those things. So what it seemed to me is that it's very important that maybe you continue. I don't know if this program continues in GCEP. We had some sort of energy. You remember we had a couple of economists. I see one in the back over there. Jim Sweeney and you and John were looking at that. It's very important that we continue looking at what really happens on the ground, so that you can direct the program quite. But it's quite troubling that things are going this way, if you want, I would say.
Yes, the idea that we used a global recession to reduce carbon emissions suggests that might not be the best way to do it. So Nate, you want to, do you have anything more to add on that, that question of how the landscape has altered?
I think the landscape's altered in a couple ways that haven't been touched on here. One is that even in the high levels of the administration, maybe that will change. It always changes non-political in a sense. We have an awareness that energy technology, clean energy technology is an important thing for the country to be doing. And we actually have people who you feel you can call up and talk to and talk to about this problem. That's clearly changed from a decade ago when the focus was just on oil prices, basically, and that was pretty much it. So the change has permeated not just the United States, but to essentially all governments. This is a high-level policy issue now that wasn't on anybody's horizon. People actually vote about it in some cases. So it's a big issue. That's changed, and I think that won't go away. I think the second thing that's changed is this ability to forecast. The IEA, the EIA, they've been, Shell, every company's been running forecasts out for the next 20 years for as long as they've been running forecasts. And yet there's now a feeling that, as I showed at the Vail Energy Forum, that the forecasts for 2050 aren't the conventional linear forecasts that are set in stone, but that are things that we can change and we can control, and that we actually don't know what the energy landscape is in 2050 because it's wide open, because it's ours to invent. And so that's changed, that we actually think that we can change those paths with our science and technology and policy mix in a way that will change the trajectory relative to what it would have been if we went on business as usual. I think those are the two big changes.
Mm-hmm. Those indeed are big changes. In response to Philippe's 10-year plans, I'm reminded of the comment that attributed to Dwight Eisenhower, who said that planning for the battle was absolutely essential, but once the battle started, the plans weren't worth a damn. So I think there may be some element of that here. So we have a few minutes now for questions before the break. So you have questions from the audience? I see one back over here. Yeah, it's on.
Thank you. Steve Cadivar. Currently, I'm with the California Department of Transportation. PhD at Stanford, 1979, in civil engineering. Listening to Sea of Change, I just want to share a story. I came to Stanford in 1973 with a copy of my master thesis from McGill University, written in 1970, about potential for wind power energy utilization in Eastern Canada. I thought I could continue this into a PhD program at Stanford. When I spoke with anybody here, you got to be kidding, no money. So listening to Sea of Change, it's just a good story here. Then I switched to dam and water resources, which I was happy to do that. Since the beginning of this 2002, when this program started, a question came in my mind that in the early years, the issue was we talk about technology issue, not policy. But toward last year or a year before that, it seems that we're talking about policy. Why at the beginning it was only technical and then now you switched to policy? Thank you.
So perhaps I could take a crack at that. So the mandate for GCEP is to look broadly across primary energy resources and the ways that we transform those, convert those into energy services that we all can use, electricity, mechanical work, and so on. And at the same time reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So GCEP itself, the research that we fund and the research that we do is very much focused on all that technical part. But we know, as several speakers this morning observed that all of this takes place in a policy landscape that has a big impact. So in the GCEP Symposium, we've tried to bring in some of those ideas, partly as a way to enrich the conversation here in the energy community at Stanford, and partly to recognize that they are important. At Stanford, as you probably know, we actually do have an active group of investigators in a variety of places, in management science and engineering, in economics, in the biz school, in the Institute for International Studies, the program on energy and sustainable development. So there's quite a lot of activity, and what we're really trying to do as a whole is to make sure that we have in front of us a fully enriched conversation on energy. And this might be a good place for me to give a little plug for the Precourt Institute for Energy here at Stanford. We formed that in 2009, and I graduated from GCEP to be the director of the Energy Institute. And thank goodness we have Sally Benson to run GCEP. So that's by the way, is an important example of the idea that you should always replace yourself with somebody smarter and better at the job than you were, and we did that with Sally. So the formation of the Energy Institute was really an attempt to make sure that we really did have this fully enriched conversation across the whole campus, and to look for opportunities to work together when it makes sense for us to do so. I'm fond of observing that no faculty member at Stanford does anything because I tell them to. They didn't when I was dean, and they don't now that I'm an institute director. But what they do is to respond to really important questions where they can make some sort of progress. And so this effort now is to make sure that the important questions are before us and that we harness the creativity of the students and faculty working across the full campus. So enough of a lecture from me. So in the back, I see one of them.
Ian Monroe, Stanford Earth Systems program. I actually teach a course that came out of the GCEP talk from a couple of years ago on climate change decision making, so thanks for that. It's been great. My question basically follows off that last comment on policy, where we now have the $90 billion from the federal government for clean energy financing coming up as a pretty significant political issue. And it doesn't seem like there's been a lot of serious public debate about what actually has been the outcome of that investment. And it seems like programs like GCEP and partnerships between academia and industry can have a lot to add to that debate. So I'm just curious what you all see as the role moving forward from GCEP and more broadly academic and industry partnerships, basically communicating what are the trade-offs and benefits of investment in clean energy, as well as some of the challenges that you face, because it seems like we do have a point that we're hitting now where we could have really cheap natural gas for the next decade, which could have something similar to what we saw after oil prices dropped after the oil embargo. And so what do we need to do to keep basically this momentum moving forward that we've seen over the last decade, continuing into decades in the future with public outreach?
Well, that's a great question. That's what you say when you're stalling to think up some thing. So anybody want to take a crack at this?
I'll step out on this. Brian Flannery talked about at the outset of GCEP, there was concern about academic freedom because of the funding from industry. That would be small compared to the uproar that would be created if a handful of companies were trying to act in the policy space, I think. Particularly, and I'll be honest, if ExxonMobil's label is on it. So I think this program is not well suited to step into the policy space. I think that the role we can best fill is to stay in this fundamental science space, focused, as Lynn talked about, on things that have scale-up potential, and leave the policy discussions for perhaps a broader forum, and Precourt might be that example.
So this is a good example of why the institute exists, and there certainly are groups. There's the Stanford Center for Environment and Energy Policy Analysis that Larry Goulder runs. The groups in Management Science and Engineering, the Program on Energy Sustainable Development. All of those have played some roles in the policy debate, and I know a number of them are thinking about exactly those sorts of questions. So you're absolutely right. They're important questions before us, and I think we should contribute, but probably not specifically funded through GCEP. Anybody else want to comment on that? Okay, we probably have time for one.
There's one in the back there.
Oh, wait a minute. Yes, so one more back here, and then I see another potential speaker back there.
Hello. Yes, thank you. I'm Greg Roberts, a graduate student researcher, so thank you for your funding. And I have the pleasure of working on Shannon Miller's combustion device, so it still works. Thank you. I have just a quick question about return on investment, and I'm curious about the companies that contribute to GCEP, and if there is some kind of a technological feedback mechanism. I'm just curious if you have any specific examples, say, of any kind of oil refinery process that has changed because of this research, or is Toyota making better cars? I mean, do people in these companies pay attention to what goes on, and are they interested in the results, and does that feed back to any specific change?
Yep.
Do you want to?
Well, you know, in companies, the only good strategy here is a portfolio strategy, right? Because you always are going to have winner and loser, right? So in our company, we thought CCS would be something that would develop quickly, okay? And how should I put that nicely? Okay, it was one of the slow things in my thing when things went fast and things went slow. This being said, in terms of the understanding of the prime, for example, the scientific and the technical understanding of what's going on for CO2 in porous media has made tremendous progress over the last 10 years. And I think GCEP and some of the people who I don't want to look at, but well, maybe sitting in the room too, have made tremendous progress in there. And so we have a very good foundation for the day things will pick up. Now, when it will pick up, it's another 10-year plan to make, right? So portfolio-wise, we are okay. You know, if you look at the individual project, sometimes you have disappointment. Somebody said something very important is that in this business, to me, you have to have two qualities. One is to be execution-driven. Execution is the key thing, right? How to make it right. And the second is that you have to be patient, okay? Because if you're not patient, you know, you're going to miss tremendous opportunities because you give up too quickly. So we have not given up on CCS, but it is slow.
Well, on that happy note, alas, we've run out of time, and so I'll ask you to join me in thanking the panelists for their contributions.